Okay, I'm picking up from where we left off. Let's have a look at chapter 23, which you can probably recognise from the image, is the chapter with the proposal. So let's get started, shall we? We'll have a look at this chapter. I'm not going to read it all out for you, but let's highlight our way through it. So first of all, as always in Jane Eyre, one of the things we do need to talk about is her use of pathetic fallacy. So you can see here straight away this idea of how happy she is. It's splendid, it's pure, it's radiant. You know that something very happy is going to happen. And just look at the language that's used to describe this. So sweetest, radiant, pure. This language puts together this image of this lovely, beautiful, pastoral image of where this proposal is going to take place. It shows you about Jane's feelings about the situation. You can talk about the idea that day its fervid fires is wasted, the idea that the fire of the thing has gone down into something that's pure and sweet. Again, you've got this idea of charm, it's magical, gem, the idea that it's precious to her. This whole idea again of jewels, it's seen as this evening is very precious to her and precious in her memory, and that's highlighted in the language. She begins to talk about her walk through the situation. Here, look at this sentence, because this sentence is very interesting. She talks about how, in the beginning, while such honeydew fell, I felt. So this is in the past tense. And then mid-sentence, which is very odd grammatically, my step is stayed. So she switches into the present tense and then stays in the present tense. I know it well. And this highlights this idea that she knows exactly this moment. She feels it as though it's happening to her in the present moment. It's not something that she feels like it's a memory. It's something that she feels like she's reliving. She describes the garden again as Eden-like. So she sees it as a paradise. She again finds this very precious. But there's a hint of darkness in that, because obviously we know that Eden is lost, paradise is lost. There's a sense of betrayal embedded in that idea. So that goes with this idea of it being Eden-like. It's very precious and very beautiful at the moment, but it will definitely go wrong. Mr. Rochester doesn't immediately see her, but he then calls her over to look at a bug. Focuses on the wings of the bug, because obviously we talk about wings a lot of the time, the idea of flying and freedom. The fact that it reminds him of a West Indian insect just brings up this idea for the reader again of Bertha, especially in a second reading. It pulls in this idea that Bertha is present still in this moment. Mr. Rochester asks her to sit outside with him. Now, remember, of course, that for a Victorian woman to be sitting outside with her employer when she is not married to him and there is nobody to chaperone them would be seen as an insane thing to do. It would be seen as absolutely improper and really unprofessional. And it's the type of thing that often got women fired. So she, understandably, wants to tell him that she's not going to do that, but she feels like she has to stay. She can't think of a way to get out of it. You could argue that she can't think of a way to get out of it because she actually quite likes him and quite wants to stay. He asks her a lot of questions, and again, and you've seen this throughout the novel, she answers in these very short, terse statements. He asks her if she's become attached to it, and then he says, "It is always the way of events in this life. No sooner have you settled in a pleasant resting place than a voice calls out to you to rise and move on, for the hour of repose is expired." Now, especially this part is obviously huge foreshadowing for the end of the novel when the voice calls out to Jane, because she's just found a place that's relatively pleasant to stop, and then she has to move on and she has to go back to Rochester. She asks if she must leave, almost begging to stay. She describes it as a blow, so she feels physically injured by his words because she's so upset. He almost mocks her here. He's very much taunting her into expressing her feelings. He tells her straight up that he is going to marry Blanche Ingram. He does describe her as an extensive armful, which suggests that he is insulting her weight, or suggesting that she's a bit of a handful. But he goes back on her. It's almost this idea that he can't help having a dig at Blanche because he doesn't like her. Look at the language he uses, though. He calls marriage the sacred noose. So it's this idea that he would see marrying Blanche as being hung. He sees it as a suicide to marry Blanche, which shows how happy he'd be about it, obviously. You then have the idea that he says they'd better trot forthwith. The idea that he knows about her. He talks about a slur conveyed upon Blanche Ingram, but he knows that she's not a very nice person. He then says, and this is kind of a nice money quote if you wanted to take one, Adele must go to school and you must get a new situation. It's this idea that he is pushing her to say something about it. He asks for employment for her. He says that she's been really good. He makes up a false position for her, which is really terrible. So it's for the 5 daughters of somebody in Ireland, and trying to send her far away. And then she says it's a long way, but that's okay. And she says it's not the voyage, it's the distance, and the sea is a barrier. A barrier from what? Is straight away what he asks. And then she tells him her feelings. From you, sir. Look at this italics going on here. She says that she said it involuntarily. You're going to remember in chapter 1 and chapter 2 when she says exactly what she thinks about Mrs. Reed, even though Mrs. Reed is her auntie. So you can see that coming through here. You can see, though, she pulls out, and this is lovely, if you're looking for a money quote, wealth, caste, custom intervened between me and what I naturally and inevitably loved. So it's this idea that these are the key points: wealth, caste, and custom. If it were me, I would be using those almost as subheadings when I wrote an essay about Jane's relationship with Rochester. I'd be thinking about the difference in wealth, I'd be thinking about the difference in social status or caste, and I would be thinking about the customs of the time. I'd put gender in with caste because at that time gender was akin to social status. So Rochester pushes this idea even further forward. He says he definitely thinks that he's never going to see her again. He says it's morally certain. He calls her again my little friend. We've talked about this idea of him using words to diminish her, calling her little, calling her Janet, making her seem smaller, which he does here. But then he asks, are you anything akin to me? Now it's that weird akin that we need to think about here, because it's this idea that he thinks that they're similar. She, however, just feels sad. She says, my heart was still. She feels like she has no idea what to say. And then he says this, and this is a lovely money quote, to the point where I'm actually going to change colours for it. That's how important it is. I sometimes have a queer feeling with regard to you. And then he describes it as a string under his ribs, as though they are tied together, as though they are linked together. He calls it a cord of communion. So he feels that it's almost a religious experience, but he feels like it will physically injure him, that he'll take to bleeding if they are separated. she cannot control her feelings whatsoever, so she starts sobbing. And she says that she wishes she'd never been born or come to Thornfield. Now, you're going to notice this. Look, she calls it impetuous, as though she didn't mean to say it. It was just off the cuff. And she reports her speech. She doesn't give us the direct speech. She did this as well in her discussion with John Reed. When Jane is filled with emotion to the point that she feels that she can't control herself, she distances herself from her own words or her own actions in the story by giving us reported speech rather than direct speech. Remember, Jane is telling us the story of her life from distance. This isn't happening in the present tense, even though it's written in the present tense. I mean, now it's gone back to the past tense. Can you see did speak, said? But even though it's written as though it's happening now, it's not happening now. She's writing it 10 years after she's been married to Rochester. So she's writing this way in the future. And then if you look, she talks about her emotional control is gone. So she's got vehemence of emotion, she's got grief and love, and she feels that it's claiming mastery over her. So she doesn't feel like she's master of her emotions. She feels like her emotions are above her. She talks about how she loves Thornfield. She talks about how much better it is and the reasons it's better. She hasn't been trampled. She hasn't been petrified. She hasn't been buried with inferior minds. These things that she has experienced in her past, and you notice that parallelism there, those three sentences together. She's being quite emphatic in the way that she's speaking. But those are the things that she's experienced. She has been trampled on before and petrified, like when she was at Lowood. And when she was buried with inferior minds, you could argue that that was her experience at Gateshead. But she feels that she's had a good time. She's had time with a vigorous, expanded mind, which was Mr. Rochester. She says that she's known him and feels awful, and she uses really emotional language, torn from you forever. And then she uses this sentence, which is a lovely quotation if you're looking for one to add to your bank. I see the necessity of departure, and it is like looking on the necessity of death. This idea that she feels that she cannot get over him, that she has no life without him. Now, we are going to see later on, particularly after she leaves Thornfield, is this relationship between a loss of relationship with Rochester and a loss of life for Jane. He then says, "What bride? I have no bride, Miss Ingram," and he backs down on all of it. So he is saying, "No, we're not gonna marry Miss Ingram," and she's like, "I don't understand." She says that she is roused to something like passion, so she's almost angry. You can see these exclamation marks showing how angry she is. And then these rhetorical questions. Do you think I can become nothing to you? Do you think I'm an automaton, a machine without feelings? So, like, the word robot doesn't exist yet, but do you think I'm like a robot? And can bear to have my morsel of bread snatched from my lips? Remember, she's experienced this before. Do you remember at Lowood, the older girls would take the bread away from the younger girls and their biscuits away from the younger girls? So she's experienced having this dashed away from her, and she's saying that she cannot bear it. You've got this rhetorical question again, do you think? And then look, because I'm poor, obscure, plain and little, I'm soulless and heartless. So she's saying that external appearances and class and importance don't have any relationship whatsoever to how deeply a person feels. Then, and this is such a big quote that I'm going to pick yet another colour. Oh, that's gone wrong. I have as much soul as you and feel as much heart. So she's saying she's equal to him. And then, this is a really big one. We stood at God's feet equal as we are. So she's saying, in the eyes of God, we are exactly equal. We are exactly the same. We are equal to each other. He agrees with her as we are. So he agrees with her equality. And that's what brings her to him. So at this point, he then kisses her. And obviously she's a little bit surprised by this because he's been her employer this entire time and not person who kisses her. And she says, well, hang on a second. She calls Blanche inferior to Mr. Rochester and says that she doesn't think that he loves her. And then she begs to be let to go to Ireland, even though a minute ago she didn't want to go because she feels like it's terrible. Rochester describes her as a wild, frantic bird rending its own plumage in its desperation. Remember, we have this imagery of Jane as a bird throughout. And here it's this idea that she's destroying herself in her frantic desire to be free. She then says, in another really big quotation, sorry guys, I am no bird and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will. So this pulls up this idea that Jane is free. She's describing herself as not a bird, even though she's consistently described as a bird, and she's going to, in like 4 chapters' time, describe herself as a bird again. But she's saying that she's not a bird, she's a human. She's putting herself up there. She's giving herself status in a way that you wouldn't expect a Victorian governess to give herself status. He says to her, your will shall decide your destiny. So he leaves it up to her. He leaves it up to her consistently about whether or not they'll have a relationship. With the entire thing where he's tricked her and told her the wrong thing, he was trying to make her say her feelings before he said anything. Now, you could argue that he is just manipulative, but equally you could argue that he was doing it to make sure that he wasn't imposing his feelings upon her, because she might feel pressured to accept anything, any kind of proposal from him, even if she didn't have feelings for him, because of the improvement it would give her in social class, or just because she's predisposed to do everything that he says because he's her boss. But he proposes to her here. She thinks that she's being made fun of. He proposes to her again, and she still thinks that she's being made fun of. He proposes to her again. She still thinks she's being made fun of. He finally says that she's his bride because she is his equal and his likeness, and asks her directly. He asks if she has any faith in him, and she says no, not a whit. Again, it's this idea of the bluntness that she's consistently showing. For example, do you think me ugly, Jane? Yes, sir, very. He asks if he's a liar in her eyes. Now, obviously, this is particularly entertaining for those of us who know the end of the book, because, I mean, he is already married. Again, he uses this word to diminish her, calling her little skeptic. He says that he has given a rumour that he has a much smaller fortune than he actually has. It's not true, but as soon as Miss Ingram has it, this rumour, she decides that she's not going to marry him. Jane immediately puts up this idea of her economic class, her lack of fortune, as a reason that she shouldn't be married to Rochester, and she asks to look at his face, because he's trying to order her, look at the imperative and say yes quickly. You've got that imperative and this adverb here, just showing how much he wants to order her around, and she's not being ordered around. She waits until she can see his face. His face is agitated and flushed, so you can see this idea of really strong emotion coming through in his face. He repeats these words, you torture me, you torture me. So this idea that she is giving him pain. He gives her instructions again. So again, you've got this imperative, and he asks her to give me my name, Edward. We talked about nomenclature, and it's this idea of giving his first name and thereby showing that she accepts him as an equal rather than as an employer. This comes through a little more clearly here because, again, she calls him Sir, And he says, no, call me Edward, and then she calls him Dear Edward. So it's this idea that they are equals now. Again, though, he's still using little to describe her. Now, while that might physically be true, it also gives this impression of her as being small or being diminished. It brings up the age gap between them. So again, it creates this power dynamic problem between the two of them. He, again, goes on with the imperatives, ordering her about still. But he does ask God to pardon him, so he knows what he's done wrong, and he asks that God and man don't harm them. And she says, there is no one to meddle, sir. I have no kindred to interfere. This is one of the things that he likes about her. She has no family, and because she has no family, there is nobody to interfere with the marriage. But obviously we know that the marriage is going to be interfered with because we've read the end of the book. Now, oddly, Rochester says that her having no family is the best of it. And she said if she had loved him less, she would have thought it was savage or strange. But she just thinks of it as happy because she's so happy in the situation. He asks her if she's happy, and she says yes. And then he says this very weird thing, which is very weird, so let's highlight it. It will atone, it will atone. The repetition there showing he's almost talking to himself. This idea that he murmured it. He's not saying it for her, he's saying it for him. And he asks these rhetorical questions. Is she not friendless, cold, comfortless? Will I not guard and cherish and solace her? It will expiate at God's tribunal. He's saying that he knows that God will be okay with it. And he uses this word tribunal, this idea of a judgment. He says he knows that it's sanctioned. And again, this word sanction suggests that something's allowed. It's quite legalistic. This word judgment, again, is quite legalistic. He says that he's not going to be judged by the world, but he thinks that God will forgive him. We don't know what for. I mean, we do know what for. It's because he's going to marry someone when he's already married. But Jane doesn't know what for at this time. But he says, you know, it's fine. It'll work. I feel like what I'm doing is morally the right thing. I'm taking this girl in. I'm looking after her. I've significantly raised her social status. I genuinely love her. I don't think that morally this is the wrong thing to do. Now, this is where modern opinion and the opinion of Jane Eyre obviously splits, because nowadays we probably can see some kind of logic in the way that Rochester behaves here, because his first wife is mad, and he genuinely is helping Jane by marrying her. She will genuinely be better off, and she does seem actually happy about it. She's not being forced into it. He made very sure that it was her idea that they got married. You can see through all the mocking that he's done, he really wanted to know her true feelings on the situation. But for a Victorian audience in particular, it just didn't matter whether or not his intentions were good. He was doing something that was against God's law, and that was it. That was the end of the discussion. Now, we get the first idea of the storm coming through here. A livid, vivid spark leapt out of a cloud. Here's the problem. He's just said it will be fine by God. Then thunder and lightning start. Thunder and lightning very traditionally are seen as the idea of God not being too pleased with whatever you're about to do. And it's a crack and a crash, and it's very close by, this rattling peal. And she just thinks that she'll just protect herself with Rochester. But obviously, he's just said this. The juxtaposition of these two things in the chapter suggests that this is God's response to Rochester's idea, saying, God will be fine. And God's like, no, I'm not going to be fine with this. So this storm actually forces them to go inside, and they're soaking wet from the storm. He helps to take her shawl off. Again, it's very close and very personal, particularly for a Victorian audience. And Mrs. Fairfax sees them. So straight away you have this idea of society coming in to make some kind of a judgment. He tells her to take her wet stuff off. He calls her darling, which means dear one, so suggesting that she's loved of him, and kisses her directly in front of Mrs. Fairfax, who's right there. So Mrs. Fairfax is pale, grave, and amazed because poor Mrs. Fairfax doesn't know what's gone on between Jane and Rochester, doesn't know that Rochester's proposed to her, and even if she does think that Rochester may have proposed to her, knows that this kind of thing often happens in households and feels like Jane is being put at risk because of her relationship with Rochester. Because remember, in the super unfair world of Victorian morals, even though Rochester and Jane were both kissing, Jane would be the one whose reputation was ruined and she would be the one who would normally be fired. Rochester's reputation would normally be completely fine. She decides that she'll just explain another time, although she feels upset, a pang, so like literally she feels pain at the idea that Miss Fairfax thinks that the relationship between Jane and Rochester is anything other than pure or anything other than leading to marriage. But she just feels joyful. She doesn't feel anything else. She's not questioning the situation. So even though we're seeing all of these problems in the situation, Jane doesn't see them. And there's this huge storm. The wind blew loud, near and deep. So it's on top of them. It's for them. The thunder is fierce and frequent. It's significantly stormy in their situation. Again, if you think about the beginning of the chapter compared to now, the change in weather shows this idea of the change in situation because Rochester and Jane's relationship has now moved on to a point that would be deemed morally unacceptable. But she's okay, she's safe and tranquil. Mr. Rochester does come 3 times to her during the storm to check on her. Now, that could just be out of his care for her during the storm or out of a desire not to be away from her, but equally, remember that Bertha set fire to his bed before, so he might be genuinely concerned that if Bertha has found out about what has happened, she might want to set fire to Jane as well. And then Adele tells Jane that the horse chestnut had been struck and half of it split away. We'll talk about this tree in a lot more detail because it's one of the central motifs of this novel. But for now, what I would suggest is think about the tree as either Rochester's personality, Jane's personality, the relationship between Jane and Rochester, or the relationship between Rochester and Bertha, or the relationship between Jane and Bertha. It can work in so many ways, which makes it an amazing motif if you are the kind of person who may be forced to write an essay on this at some point. Thank you very much. That was chapter 23. Good luck.